Thank you so much, Dr. Jada. Before we move on to our speakers and the first talk, I would like to request our online attendees to keep their microphones shut at all times. And we have kept it open house for queries all during the session. So in case if you have any questions regarding the talk or regarding speakers, please type in your query in the chat box and send it. Thank you so much. Now I would like to request Professor Dr. Amardeep Singh for his talk.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored to be presenting as part of this webinar, and I'm especially excited to meet several of you since this is a university that I've not had much contact with before. So I hope to stay in contact with you after we're done today. And I'm also wanted to just give one quick preface and say that this is some new material that I'm working on. I mean, obviously, like many of you, I've been very preoccupied with the pandemic over the past year. And it's been in my thoughts. I've been reading about it, learning about it. It's sort of this opportunity, this talk has given me an opportunity to think through some of the things that I've been thinking about. So grateful for that as well. So the title of my talk, and I'll be sharing a slide, hopefully that will work. Let's see if I can do that. Actually, before I start that, let me just read a little bit. The title of my talk is Imagining the Last People, Apocalyptic Plagues from Mary Shelley to Station 11. At this point, it's been a year since the global COVID-19 pandemic began, and about 9 months since the lockdowns began. Where I am, in the US, the initial lockdowns were experienced as disruptions that were widely felt and at times startling. Offices and schools closed, flights grounded, usually choked highways were suddenly empty, disruptions in the supply chain, panic in the stock market. News stories circulated showing wild animals wandering freely in urban centers. In India, people marveled at a Delhi skyline that was suddenly far less smog-ridden than usual. The normally muddy gray-green waters of the famous canals of Venice in Italy were suddenly clear blue. Was it the end of the world? Was this the beginning of a catastrophe that might disrupt nations and governments, economies, all the way up to global industrial capitalism itself? Not quite. Most essential structures remained in place and kept many people from feeling the impact as dramatically as they might have. The rumored breakdown in law and order did not occur. The supply chain in Western countries was sustained. And the fact that our electricity and internet were still on meant that many middle-class people in the information economy could continue to work from home. Capitalism could continue just fine, not anything like the end of the world. Still, and here I'd like to try and start sharing some slides. Let's see if this will work.
Yes.
Okay. And one moment. Okay, so that's not very nice. I look kind of odd in the corner there. I'm not sure if you can see me in the corner, but the coloring is rather odd. Well, anyway, I'll continue and hopefully it will not be too strange. Okay. Still, that moment of uncertainty and disruption was enough to get many of us to trigger a new awareness and to ask some key questions about ourselves. What ultimately do human beings need to survive? What do we need to experience fulfillment? And what modes of existence are truly sustainable? These are the kinds of questions that creative writers engaged in speculative fiction can ask, and that, in fact, I would argue that we as a society need them to ask. That's the slide here. COVID-19 might be the most impactful global pandemic in our lifetimes, but it is by no means the only global pandemic worthy of our attention. Nor is it the most destructive infectious disease to strike the world in recent centuries. Many comparisons have been made to the so-called Spanish flu epidemic of 1918-1919, which killed as many as 50 million people worldwide and 675,000 here in the United States. That flu was a version of the H1N1 influenza virus, the same virus responsible for the swine flu epidemic of 2009. The final death toll in 1919 might have been far higher than with COVID-19, in part because coming at the heels of World War I, many people were displaced and malnourished, living in camps where hygiene was especially poor. Before the Spanish flu, there were, of course, many famous disease epidemics, but they generally, most of them did not go global, in part because the world was so fragmented that travel and trade between disparate regions was limited. So, for example, the Black Death or bubonic plague that affected Europe between 1347 and 1351, and which may have killed more than 100 million people, is not known to have spread much beyond Europe. The advent of truly globalized pandemics, in effect, requires elements of modernity to be in place. The ability for people to travel great distances quickly, to have globalized trade routes that produced a much higher degree of interaction than previously known, and the ability to record and identify infection and death rates using modern statistical methods. Along those lines, the critic Pamela K. Gilbert has argued that the first truly global pandemic was probably 19th century cholera, which had documented spread throughout Asia in the 1817 to 1824 time period. It later spread to Europe and North and South America, with mass deaths due to the disease occurring in England, France, and the US in 1832, 1848, and 1866. I recount some of this history in part because writers who have responded to global pandemics frequently did so in response to actual outbreaks that were occurring around them and in their time periods, whether cholera, plague, or forms of the flu. So I have three texts in mind for today's talk. All three specifically invoke a concept of globalized pandemic rather than localized or regional epidemics. And all three imagine diseases so deadly and virulent that they rapidly wipe out the majority of the Earth's inhabitants, effectively forcing a civilizational reboot. The three texts I have in mind are British writer Mary Shelley's The Last Man, first published in 1826, American writer Jack London's The Scarlet Plague from 1912, and Canadian writer Emily St. John Mandel's Station 11, published in 2014. These texts often imagine human societies stripped to the absolute minimum, suggesting that ideals of social progress and development, from the revolutionary politics and scientific rationalism of Shelley's era to free market capitalism in the 20th and 21st centuries, are unsustainable dead ends that need to be fundamentally rethought. What alternative futures can be imagined? If catastrophe gives us the opportunity to restart our civilization, what aspects of the old society would we want to take with us, and what might we leave behind? So I'll start with The Last Man. Mary Shelley is best known as the author of Frankenstein in 1818, which she famously started writing in the summer of 1816, known as the Year Without a Summer, after the eruption of Mount Tambora in what is today Indonesia. As is well known, the volcanic ash from that eruption led to a generalized atmospheric disruption that affected the global climate. The legacy of that year probably impacts some of her imagery in The Last Man as well. Alongside the pandemic that wipes out nearly all of civilization, there are also a series of natural disasters and anomalies, including a mysterious black sun, as well as the appearance of comets in the novel. So she really throws the kitchen sink at humanity, and humanity does not survive. The omnipresence of sudden death in The Last Man is at least partially autobiographical, inspired by the stories of Shelley's family and friends, including her husband, Percy Shelley, who died suddenly at sea in 1822, and Lord Byron, who died of a fever which he contracted while fighting in what is generally referred to today as the Greek War of Independence. That war is an important element in the plot of The Last Man, with the character of Lord Raymond, who is based on Byron, abdicating his position of authority in England to fight for the Greek cause. The plague enters into the novel and begins to spread through Europe following the taking of Istanbul by the Greek army. A key theme in the book is the failure of Enlightenment era science and rationality. The book is set starting in an imagined year 2073, a time when the English monarchy is broken up and a movement towards radical democracy is taking shape. Lord Raymond reflects a modern romantic ideal, a person who thought sheer force of will and personality ought to give him a claim over the right to rule others. But in the first part of the book, before the plague is ever mentioned, his personal problems lead him to fail to live up to his capacity. His modern orientation and his seeming scientific competence then lead him to success on behalf of the Greek cause, But when the Greek army first encounters evidence of a virulent plague at Istanbul, he dismisses Greek fears of infection as superstition. Raymond dies apparently in a in a fire in pandemic ruined Istanbul, and then the mysterious plague begins to spread around the world. Somewhat in contrast to other post-apocalyptic narratives I've been looking at, the progress of the disease is not immediate. It takes more than a year for the world's population to fully feel the effects of the plague, and after a full 7 years, the population is left, the protagonist is left entirely alone at the end of the novel. The novel is centered around the character who turns out to be England's sole survivor, Lionel Verney, who is closely connected to a group of characters who resemble Byron, Percy Shelley, and their circle. One by one, his friends and family members die off, some of them from the mysterious plague and some of them from other causes. Verney somehow remains immune. He benefits from having been relatively isolated in his life to begin with, in contrast to his friends who had been at the center of political life in London. To read Shelley's novel is to experience a kind of deep mourning, as one after another of a dwindling party steadily die off, with Verney's 2 final companions' deaths at sea being particularly heartbreaking. Periodically, Verney reflects on his experience and compares his growing isolation to other plague narratives, such as Daniel Defoe's Diary of a Plague Year. He also contrasts his mentality at the end of the novel to the hero of another Defoe book, Robinson Crusoe. Like Crusoe, Verney is left completely isolated. But unlike Crusoe, that experience does not inspire him to begin to productively construct a world around himself. Here's a quote from The Last Man, where the protagonist is thinking about and contrasting his situation to Robinson Crusoe. Yet he, Crusoe, was far happier than I, for he could hope, nor hope in vain, the destined vessel at last arrived, to bear him to countrymen and kindred, where the events of his solitude became a fireside tale. To none could I ever relate the story of my adversity. No hope had I. And while we might expect Verney to find a comfortable and safe place to spend his days, he instead opts to stay in abandoned Italian cities to be reminded of the greatness of human civilization, even if he does so alone. Fundamentally, the takeaway from the end of this complex novel is not so much a concern about the end of the world per se, nor is it about the epidemiology of the disease that is at the center of the book. It's rather the sense of deep isolation that Verney comes to feel as he finds himself deeply alone. For Shelley, the core of human life is not in governments or scientific knowledge, it's in human sociality, the bonds that we have to one another. I'll go on to a second text, The Scarlet Plague by Jack London. And Jack London's 1912 novel, Scarlet Plague, is very different from The Last Man. And for one thing, it's quite short. It's actually a novella. It imagines a small group of survivors 60 years after an extinction event. In the novel, he is especially interested in industrial capitalism. He opens with a scene in the novel where a child is asking an aged survivor from the plague that happened 60 years earlier about what life had been like in that earlier time period. We kind of colloquially call these days the before times. The child has an old coin and he struggles to understand the abstraction of money. The president in the imagined year of 2012 was Morgan V, clearly a reference to the oligarchical dominance of J.P. Morgan and other industrial magnates in London's era. The children in London's novel and this sort of band of straggling survivors are all illiterate and innumerate. And there's an extensive passage where the old man attempts to explain the idea that there had once been 4 million people in the city of San Francisco. At another point, a young man bitterly criticizes the grandfather's insistence on describing the plague that wiped out modern civilization as scarlet, right? The old man keeps saying, the Scarlet Plague, the Scarlet Plague. And one of the children says, red is red, ain't it? Then what's the good of getting cocky and calling it scarlet? Right? The scarlet seems like an unnecessary decoration or an ornament, right? Why use ornamental language when you can simply describe the plague that killed everyone as red? Another theme is the radical equalizing of social relations. There's a scene where a woman in the novel named Vesta Van Woerden, who had been the daughter of a powerful industrial magnate and had been the wife of another, is married to an abusive man who was formerly his family's chauffeur. And so in the novel, that's seen as this kind of this scandal or disgrace, But the novelist is very clear that that is something that is, in a way, an improvement over the situation that had held before. After civilizational extinction, the small bands of immune survivors essentially return to what London describes as a, quote, savage form of existence. They hunt and fish to eat. They disregard abstraction in favor of the concrete. Their language simplifies, and they opt towards minimalism and pragmatism. The memory of what came before is, of course, an important part of London's story, but his message appears to be that in his post-apocalyptic future, none of that history will actually matter, nor should it. London's approach to lastness is fundamentally a naturalist one. Elements of human civilization that are decorative or inessential can perhaps should be dispensed with. We may lose art, literature, and scientific knowledge, but for London, it's far more important that we give up on the material inequalities that surrounded them. For Jack London, the only fundamental that matters is species survival. And at the end of his text, there seems to be enough survivors in place for that to happen. The aging survivor, who's the protagonist of the novel, reflects ambivalently that human society will in the future likely repeat itself. And I have a quote here from that. So this is toward the end of the Scarlet Plague. And it's the voice again of the old man, the survivor, who had been there before and is explaining it to the children. The gunpowder will come. Nothing can stop it. The same old story over and over. Men will increase and men will fight. The gunpowder will enable men to kill millions of men. And in this way only, by fire and blood, will a new civilization in some remote day be evolved. And of what profit will it be? Just as the old civilization passed, so will the new. In effect, London's naturalist orientation leaves little room for human agency or the possibility of gaining wisdom. In effect, we're doomed to continue to repeat the same mistakes over and over again. And I'll end with a consideration of a newer novel. This is a 2014 novel called Station 11 that was published by a Canadian writer called Emily St. John Mandel. Emily St. John Mandel's vision of an apocalyptic plague in her 2014 novel, Station 11, shares with some of the fundamental traits of London's story. There's a global plague that essentially wipes out industrial civilization. She attends to the rapid turn towards social disorder as the pandemic spreads, as well as the exodus from big cities. Her story starts in Toronto. As with London, Jack London's story, the number of survivors of what Mandel calls the Georgia flu is so small that larger social abstractions, ideas of national borders, centralized governments, or the news media essentially disappear overnight. Electrical grids and the internet go offline. What remains are small bands of survivors who either miraculously escape exposure or who might have been immune to begin with. As with the Jack London story, people who had formerly been artists or thinkers now have to learn to hunt and at times to fight for survival. But unlike the Jack London story, art and the creative imagination continue to play an important role. The protagonist in the novel, Kirsten, is part of a group called the Traveling Symphony, which goes from town to town performing orchestral music as well as the occasional Shakespeare play. Their motto is, quote, "Survival is insufficient." The phrase is also tattooed on the protagonist's arm. Curiously, for a book that is very invested in the ongoing link to canonical figures like Shakespeare, the motto, "Survival is insufficient," comes not from a high culture source, but from a Star Trek episode. But survival is insufficient is a good descriptor of the ethos of the novel as a whole. In contrast to London, Mandel is imagining a post-apocalyptic version of life where survivors would do little more than simply hunt and fish and try to continue the species. By contrast, in Mandel's novel, they would still need art, music, and literature. They would be drawn to the relics of the old civilization, but not necessarily out of an aspiration to recreate it. Periodically, Mandel inserts lyrical passages imagining the vastness of the difference that felt in the world after the pandemic virus wiped out industrial civilization. And so this is a passage from the novel, and it's called An Incomplete List. And some of it may be a little bit hard to read off the corner of my screen, so forgive me for that on the slide. No more diving into pools of chlorinated water lit green from below. No more ball games played out under floodlights. No more porch lights with moths fluttering on summer nights. No more trains running under the surface of cities on the dazzling power of the electric third rail. No more cities. No more flight. No more towns glimpsed from the sky through airplane windows, points of glimmering light. No more looking down from 30,000 feet and imagining the lives lit up by those lights at that moment. No more countries, all borders unmanned. No more internet, no more social media, no more scrolling through litanies of dreams and nervous hopes and photographs of lunches, cries for help, and expressions of contentment and relationship status updates with heart icons whole or broken. Lists like this trigger us to consider what's truly fundamental. Reactions are bound to be subjective. In my own subjective response to this particular passage, a few things stand out. For instance, this past year, I have not missed flying in airplanes, which is largely for me an unpleasant experience. But I have missed time spent in cities, on trains, in swimming pools. One might ask, why something so idiosyncratic? Why would she mention in that list, in this kind of litany of things that are no longer there, why would she mention something like swimming pools? As we consider what truly matters in the face of the ongoing pandemic we are experiencing here in the real world today, we might want to be careful not to fall into Jack London's trap of assuming that only aspects of life directly connected to raw survival should matter to us. If we want to avoid repeating the errors of human society before apocalyptic catastrophes can take hold, we need to think carefully and critically about what aspects of the old civilization really matter to us. If we have the chance to rebuild, we would be well served to rebuild more sustainably and equitably. We would also want to make sure to find ways to preserve things that we find to be beautiful, whether that's works of art and literature or access to idiosyncratic experiences and pleasures. So again, that's where the swimming pool comes in. It's something we don't need to survive. It's something that this particular author found to be beautiful. Those are the things, Mandel suggests, that make life worth living and that make difficult lives bearable. I'll stop on that note and I'll turn off the screen sharing. Thanks for letting me share my screen. Hang on one second here. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mr. Singh. That was a great talk and a very big hand for Mr. Singh.
Lovely talk, Professor Dr. Amardeep Singh. I would like to request Dr. Becky Carver to give a post-talk comment on Dr. Amardeep's talk. Becky, you've got to unmute yourself.
Hi. Yeah, I thought it was a fascinating talk, and I was very interested in the representation of isolation in The Last Man, and obviously Shelley is associated with isolation, normally associated with Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster. Like for most of us, that would be the more familiar text. And I wondered whether you'd thought about echoes between The Last Man and the monster. Now, they're both these solitary figures, but they're affected by different kinds of crises. So it's really a question about the type of crisis and what kind of solitude it imposes. Is there something distinctive about the solitude of The Last Man?
All right. Yes.
Can I answer that?
Yes, of course.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure in case you wanted to proceed with other talks or whether I should address that. No, I'll just briefly address that. It's a great point. I mean, there is a lot of overlap. The way the monster in Frankenstein experiences his sense of isolation and his kind of repeated rejection by human beings, right? That the human society again and again in the novel, when he approaches them, when he appeals to them, turns him away out of horror and repulsion. His request, right? His request to Frankenstein is to have a mate, right? To have company. And and we know how the novel ends. It doesn't end well, but there's a kind of sense there of a life that's about to begin, right? A pattern of life, a new way of being that could emerge with the monster, and that is sort of thwarted. And I think that the contrast might be with The Last Man might be that what Shelley is describing in this novel, it's only, 8 years later, but her life is so drastically different. And in a way, the story she wants to tell is of everything shutting down, is of loved ones, companions, friends, society itself retreating, withdrawing, eventually just disappearing entirely. And so instead of beginning, she's talking about endings. And in addition to it being about an apocalypse or about a pandemic, I think the novel is also about mourning. It's about what it's like to lose loved ones. And for me, those are the most poignant passages in the novel. And there are long passages about the war in Greece and about British politics and parliamentary politics that I did not find as exciting. But I do think that those parts are really powerful and moving, and they do suggest an overlap with Frankenstein. So yes.
Right. Before we go on to next, I have a question of my own, and one from Dr. Sohail Ahmed Said, who is sitting with us. The question is, there are two questions. One is that I was thinking that does the Scarlet Plague somewhat gives an impression that the disease has to do somewhat with the social strata of the society that you belong to. That is one part. And the second part is that how pandemic and late capitalism are related. If you could answer that, Professor Dr. Amardeep.
Well, on the first question, I don't think there's a class. As with all three of these novels, the pandemics that are described in the novels destroy virtually all social order and existing institutions. They affect rich and poor alike. They affect Europe. They affect Asia. They affect Africa. They affect the whole world, and essentially, reduce human society to bare minimal fragments of a few straggling bands of survivors here and there at most. So I don't think there's a class to mention there. I mean, I think he is, it's interesting because he wrote the novel in 1912. We often think of that time period as a time period of the Spanish flu, which is a few years later. But he could be inspired partly by what we call scarlet fever, right? That particular illness. But it could also be, it could be something like the flu. I mean, the kind of symptoms that he describes are a little bit like the flu. In any case, so that's one part of it. The other question was about global industrial capitalism and global pandemics. And I think this is definitely a really interesting and important question. And it's one that I'm still thinking through. But what I think is going on is that I think that these stories, insofar as that there's a pattern, and there are other novels that tell these kinds of stories, imagining apocalyptic plagues, they are imagining a networked, globalized world, and they're imagining what that world would look like once everything came to a halt, once everything stopped. So to some extent, these authors are not necessarily interested in pandemics per se. They aren't interested per se, I think, in epidemiology. I don't think Jack London knew a lot about epidemiology. I think Emily Mandel does know a lot about it, but it's not the point of her novel. I think the point is to use these triggers, use these events as opportunities to think about what's fundamentally important to us. And I think for both Jack London and for Emily Mandel, what's important is not the survival of the big kind of structures that we think of in industrial capitalism. It's not access to luxury goods or conveniences. It's small things, it's personal relationships, and there's a kind of critique of modern capitalism in both of those novels. And so I think that's kind of how I see that connection. That I guess another way of putting it is, these are novels describing globalized societies, and the pandemic is a way of forcing those societies to rethink their values and to question themselves in really fundamental ways.
Thank you, Professor. And that's very true, because we have seen